Open source is the software of the people, but the people sometimes don't know how to use it. It ain't documented worth a hill of beans, and we feel stupid, so as people get scared often we don't choose it. Open source software. We all know what that is, don't we?
Open source software exists as a result of the combined efforts of millions of computer programmers, users, and software vendors from around the world. They share their intellectual property freely, and they believe that software should cost nothing and should enrich the lives of users.
But then, next thing you know, you see something like this. What are you supposed to think?
Look, open source software just means that the source code for the software's program, is open. Open for everyone to study, chew on, change, improve. It's not like that proprietary software. What was that? Something from Meat So Soft that I got in so much trouble just for tasting to try to see what it was made of. No, open source software is all about knowing what's in it. And I gotta tell you, it's tailor-made for libraries. I've been digging up some research on it, tracking it down on my computer.
The Bulletin of the American Society of Information Science and Technology did a special issue on open source software and libraries in 2009. The guest editor, Eric Leese Morgan, has been writing articles about open source and libraries in national venues since at least 2001. This special issue provides a great overview of some of what open source is, can do, and has done for libraries. As he says here, and as we've heard from other commentators, open source software basically requires that a program's source code be accessible, allows users to change the code to suit their needs, and rules that any code they change and distribute must also be open source. Morgan often writes in a motivational, inspirational way about open source software, as he does here. And really, you can see that even though it's about accessible code, it's about so much more than accessible code for so many people. Morgan says open source is about control of the computer infrastructure, about free, as in liberty, about community, opportunity, flexibility. This article on Greenstone Digital Library open source software is about how open source can be used in inspirational ways for inspirational projects. At first I felt the special issue just included it sort of for the wow factor. And then as I read it, I found myself saying, wow. Greenstone is software for building and distributing digital library collections, and it's being used worldwide, especially in Africa and Southeast Asia, to collect and distribute information on health, nutrition, agriculture, disaster relief, vital topics that are vitally important in places where traditional libraries are not really in the picture. Greenstone was started in New Zealand in 2000 to curate a collection of documents in Maori, the native language of New Zealand. And now it's in 70 countries, holding media in 50 languages, and it's downloaded an average of 6,500 times each month, which is boggling. When I turned from Greenstone to this article on the viability of open source software for integrated library systems in more conventional libraries, it was like pulling my mind back home from the far reaches of the world. But this article is interesting in how it shows open source software is gaining more and more market acceptance because libraries have become frustrated with commercial vendors. partly because they might stop developing a product that a library had bought into, and partly because commercial software just wasn't meeting their needs. This article also makes the point that the most successful open source IL systems are each closely tied to a commercial business that markets, develops, and supports it. One of these open source integrated library systems came into being just one state south of Tennessee, in Georgia. I thought it might be a good idea to see just what those Georgia folks have been up to, and I had a notion where I might extract that information. The Georgia Public Library Service began developing an open-source integrated library system for Pines, a consortium of public libraries throughout Georgia, in 2004, and this system, Evergreen, went live in 2006. Why did they do it? Because they wondered, is our data driving our software procedures, or are our software procedures driving our data? They worried that any commercial integrated library system software would shape their policy and procedures when they wanted their policy and procedures to shape the software. So they went through a process called requirements gathering, where they consulted hundreds of staff and hundreds of roles in Georgia libraries, saying, if you can dream it, we can do it. They consolidated the central themes from this research and gave them to a team of local developers, and now Evergreen is used in 305 Georgia libraries and 1,000 other libraries throughout the world. Emily Almond, who described Evergreen's origins in this YouTube video, said people will ask her, "Open source, that's free, right?" And her reply, well, no. She said that going from proprietary to open source software to operate their integrated library system meant shifting a lot of resources, that open source isn't necessarily less expensive. Allman used this image to illustrate the shifting of resources. When the Georgia Public Library Service used proprietary software for its integrated library system, it spent a lot of money on the software, but not so much on support infrastructure. Now, with the open source integrated library system is developed, Georgia Public Library Service spends less money on the software, but more on the support infrastructure. This image makes a similar point, showing how responsibilities used to be divided between the library team and a commercial vendor, and how they're divided now between the library team and the contracted software developers and open source community that support their software. Reflecting on all of this, I was moved to compile this table illustrating what the novice software user might notice along the path from proprietary to open source software. I don't feel confident about many things, but I am confident about my status as a novice software user. Aspects may vary according to software product, but in my experience, the learning curve is steeper for open source. The documentation for open source may be harder to find or understand, and programming expertise, while not essential for using open source, would definitely be extremely helpful. On the other hand, proprietary software is embedded in a culture of, well, business, while open source software is embedded in a culture of mostly goodwill and cooperation. All of this might bear some thought, since there's open source software out there not just for other library tasks, but for people with less money, people like students and, well, all of us at one time or another. With a little burrowing, it should be easy to find some good examples. Open source software for library tasks such as online catalogs includes Scriblio, Blacklight, SOPAC, and Viewfind. For online repositories, DSpace and Fedora. For resolving metadata, Cuffs and Library Find, and much more. This blog, The Creative Librarian, and this wiki, Library Successes, are filled with examples and stories of success in using them. The largesse continues. There is open source educational software for students of all ages, design software for art, math software, celestial software illuminating the planets. The list goes on and on. This wiki, K-12 open source, describes a lot of them. For regular old people, there are open source standbys like WordPress for blogging, OpenOffice for word processing, chart and form software for small business use. InfoWorld even grants awards each year to what they judge as the best open source software applications. Still, I must confess, none of this addresses what is, for me, sometimes a very complicated reaction to open source software. It's kind of hard to describe in words, and, well, maybe I should just show you.
Why won't this open source software work the way it's supposed to? This works for everyone but me. Once again, the computer hates me and I don't know what to do.
You gotta remember, open source software means your options are open. If you can't sniff down a trail to a solution online, then go fetch that neighbor down the street, the one that always carries 5 jump drives in his shirt pocket and has all those cats. You can't be too shy. You can't be the lone wolf. Maybe this open source software can help you learn something important. Challenges can be opportunities. Nobody's locked you up in no doghouse. The roads are open, and you've got the power.
Open source is the software of the people, so the people maybe ought to try to use it. Just round up some expert help. Don't be shy or stingy, use your head. Try not to feel persecuted.